the number of students who say they are neither male nor female. It peaks in 2023 and then it falls in half between 2023 and 2025. My argument is really that this is very much an independent fashion. It was very fashionable, reached a peak, and then it lost popularity in some way. Non-conforming in terms of gender and sexuality is just less cool. It is less fashionable than it was in 2023. My name's Eric Kaufmann. I'm professor of politics at the University of Buckingham in the UK. I looked at a number of major surveys, and one of the cornerstone is really the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which basically surveys upwards of 50,000 undergraduates in the United States each year from around 250 different institutions. We also have a number of smaller surveys. And so what we see is a rise in the number of students who say they are neither male nor female. That goes up from 2020. It peaks in 2023, and then it falls in half between 2023 and 2025. And the second thing I found is also the share who identify as queer, questioning, or bisexual. In other words, a sexual orientation that is not heterosexual and it's not gay or lesbian. So all of the rest, if you like, of that sexual orientation. Now that kind of non-conforming sexuality went up alongside the trans trend, peaked in 2023 and has come down about 10 percentage points. So quite a dramatic drop there as well, at the same time as the non-conforming gender identities drops. What's interesting is that the patterns over time in these three surveys largely track each other. Bisexuality, it doubles between 2010 and 2020. Queer and these other categories, these are the really fast-growing categories. But the gay lesbian is in some way an older, more traditional category. The actual gay lesbian numbers pretty steady. It's gone up a little bit, but it's been pretty steady. I'm sort of thinking that nonconformity is behind this, and this idea, so gender and sexual nonconformity, I think there's a connection there, and that's going to push you into the newer categories and not the older ones, in my view. This is very much an independent fashion. It was very fashionable, reached a peak, and then it lost popularity in some way. None of these surveys ask explicitly, what biological sex were you born? How do you identify now? But we can sort of we can see over time there's this trend of rising and falling in non-binary share. Now, my presumption is someone who is trans, who's transitioned, is going to be much more likely to tick the non-binary box than just a person who is the same gender as they were born. So this is an indicator of transgenderism. First of all, if you take trans organizations, they would include non-binary in the definition of trans. Okay, that's one point. The other point is that it depends what model we're working with. My assumption is that somebody who is a man and winds up as a woman is going to go through an intermediate stage, a gateway stage of non-binary, where they have uncertainty about their gender. And so in order to get to the other side, you have to get through the middle non-binary category. And so non-binary is kind of like the feeding pool for the full transition. And so any trends that are occurring with the non-binary are going to affect that full transition trend. So I'd be convinced the other way. If you took any other survey and showed the trans trend, that is people who were born in one sex and identify as the other in a binary way. So born male, identify female. If you show me that trend is rising while the non-binary share is falling, or vice versa, so that these two trends are not moving together, then I'm going to say, oh, you've got a point. Wow. I'm just skeptical that that's the case. So the other piece of this is mental health. There's a very strong correlation between nonconformity in gender and sexuality and poor mental health. So more anxiety and more depression. That does seem to be part of the story, but it is not most of the story. Between 2021 and 2023, so the lockdown and pandemic is over, you see an improvement in mental health between those years in that CDC sample. But the problem in a way is, okay, so the peak of the pandemic is like 2021, and sometime between 21 and 23, there was an improvement in mental health. But what we saw in the FIRE data is 23 was the peak for nonconformity of gender and sexuality. So it's not moving together the way we would expect if these things were completely dependent on each other. So I think part of it is improve mental health, but part of it is just independently non-conforming in terms of gender and sexuality is just less cool. It is less fashionable than it was in 2023. Is it connected to politics? Have young people become more conservative? Have they become more religious, less woke? The actual findings that I see in the data don't support that explanation. So the students don't seem to have become more conservative or more religious. They're not less conservative or less religious, but that's been very stable, even as their sexuality has become more quote-unquote conservative. All we can kind of do is a bit of tea leaf reading, but when the trans trend was at its peak in the data, 2022-23, what you saw is that the freshmen were more trans, if you like, than the seniors. So you would have predicted the trend is going to move in the direction of an increase. But then what happens is you get that flattening out, so there's no difference between freshmen and seniors. And now as we get into 2025, where we've seen a drop in trans identification overall, what you see is that the freshmen are actually less likely to identify as other than male and female than the seniors. So if we think that the leading edge is going to be the youngest cohort, if they're the future, then you would predict the future would be a continued decline. According to that, I think it raises question marks to the progressive view of history. That if there is a view of the arc of history is moving in a certain direction, and now it really is going against the way it's supposed to be moving, then I think it raises questions for the cultural progressive movement.